Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Authenticity Advantage. As promised, this will be a 15-minute webinar, so we are going to move at a pretty brisk pace. We're going to spend an additional 15 minutes after the webinar to answer any questions. So you can submit questions either through your panel on the right-hand side, or you can also tweet us if you prefer. So for those of you who don't know us, let's put a face with the voices for you. My name's Jason Lauritsen. I'm the tall one on the right of your screen. I'm CEO and co-founder of Talent Anarchy. My fellow co-founder, Joe Gerstandt, is the bald and sassy gentleman on the left. Joe will join us here in just a moment. To put today's content, I guess, in context, a little bit about Talent Anarchy. We're in the business of helping organizations build cultures that fuel innovation. Specifically, we provide consulting, training, and facilitation solutions that cultivate these critical elements of any innovative culture: connection, inclusion, and liberation. Today, we're going to talk about a central piece of inclusion: authenticity. So here's our agenda. We don't have a lot of time together today, so the agenda is pretty simple, pretty short. We'll start by talking about what authenticity is. We'll talk about why it's critically important to your business. And finally, we'll share with you the process for how you cultivate authenticity in your organization. So let's dig in and get started. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. I think you're going to need to let me advance the slides, but I think it's really important for us to start by getting some real clarity around what it is that we're talking about today, because authenticity is definitely a word that has taken on buzzword status, and it's thrown around very casually by folks, and it's thrown around casually as if it's a simple and common and safe and ordinary thing, and I think the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. But we don't use it as a buzzword. We use it in very specific ways. And when we talk about authenticity or being authentic, what we're talking about is being true to who you are. And even that sounds like maybe a simple or even an automatic thing. But again, the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. And I think to really appreciate how difficult and challenging authenticity can be, especially within the context of work, it's important to think about the impact of conformity and social pressure on our lives. Wonderful story. A gentleman by the name of Gordon McKenzie wrote a book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. And it's a wonderful book. It's about his experience working in the creative services division of Hallmark for 30 years. And it's a book about creativity and expression and organizational culture and authenticity. And one of the stories that he shares in this book involves his experience of working with youth. He says that if you go into a kindergarten classroom and you ask those students which ones of them are an artist or which ones are creative, almost everyone in the class will raise their hands. If you go visit that same group of students 3 or 4 years later and ask the same question, about half of them will raise their hands. 3 or 4 years later, the same group of students ask the same question, about a third of them will raise their hands. And if you revisit that class when they're graduating seniors and ask them that question, one of them will raise their hands. And so a simple but I think profound example of how we pick up on a lot of different cues and have a tendency to play small as we go through life, increasingly playing small because we want to fit in, we want to belong, I think especially within the context of work. So for us, authenticity is not a buzzword. It's a very real and a very righteous thing. We don't think that it's terribly simple or safe or very common, especially within the context of work, but we do think that it's a very powerful thing. It's a very important thing. It's one of the ways in which organizations and individuals can really differentiate themselves and set themselves apart. It's also kind of important when we're talking about authenticity to remember that this isn't about necessarily being the most tattooed or dyed or pierced person in your office. Again, it's about being true to who you are, and so that's going to look a little bit differently for each of us. We really like to use the phrase flying your freak flag rather than simply saying be authentic or being authentic, and we like that phrase for a couple of reasons. One is that it reminds us that this is an activist thing that we're talking about. It's not an intellectual endeavor. It's not an attitude or a state of mind. It's about making sure that you know who you are and that that stuff is showing up in your actions and your behaviors and your decisions. It's an activist thing. And the other reason why we really like this phrase is that it also reminds us of the truth that if we are being true to who we are as unique individuals, there are going to be times when we are the weirdo, when we are the oddball or the outlier. And part of doing this is being a little bit more comfortable in that role. And part of doing this for those of us that are building and managing and directing and coordinating workforces is to support our employees in being more comfortable in playing that role from time to time of being in the minority, of being the outlier or the weirdo. So it's going to look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. But that's a little bit of kind of context of what we're talking about when we're talking about authenticity. We also want to talk a little bit about why this is important, give you kind of a nutshell business case for this. And there's a lot of things that we could talk about in this section. We're just going to focus on 4 points that we think are really at the heart of the business case. We want to take a look at authenticity as it relates to individual happiness, as it relates to having smart teams, as it relates to creativity, and as it relates to being connected or having a powerful network of relationships. But let's start with happiness. And this one is probably the most obvious. I think it's fairly easy to understand that authenticity and happiness are closely linked. The less that you have to conform or adjust who you are at work, the more welcome and accepted you're going to feel. The easier it is, the more likely you are to be happy. The problem here is that we have a tendency to see happiness as kind of a touchy-feely thing. So at work, I think oftentimes shy away from advocating for it. Happiness is a real thing. It's a valid thing. It informs how I feel about my work. It informs how I apply myself to my work. It can even impact how my brain is functioning while I'm at work. So happiness does matter, and we should not hesitate to advocate for it on our own behalfs and for those around us, our peers and our coworkers. The second point is related to building smart teams, and we seem to kind of have this default approach, this belief that if we simply group smart individuals together, we'll end up with smart or talented teams. And the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. Groups do have real advantages over individuals when it comes to creativity and the accuracy of their decision-making. The problem is that groups rarely live up to that potential, not because they don't have enough smart people or smart enough people, but because of how they function as a group, because the groups so often avoid tension, conflict, and disagreement. Groupthink is a terribly common thing in the workplace, and it compromises a group's ability to make good decisions and solve problems. So what we do is we bring 10 or 12 or 15 people together, but we oftentimes only actually utilize 2 or 3 or 4 of their perspectives and ideas and experiences. The rest gets wasted. So very wasteful thing. Groups lose their way when the individual members stop thinking for themselves. So if we want to, as managers, as HR and OD professionals, if we want to keep groupthink in check, which is incredibly important for our organization, then advocating and rewarding authenticity is probably one of our most powerful ways to approach that. Throw it back over to you, Jason.
All right. Authenticity also fuels creativity. With innovation of increasing importance to our businesses, finding ways to help employees be more creative is critical. And there still seems to be this idea in place that certain kinds of people are creative and others are not. And this is total nonsense. Every individual is inherently creative. Now, we may not all be famous for the works of art that we create, but there are many ways to be creative. It might show up in how we communicate or how we dress or how we solve problems. But each of us is a unique being and a unique bundle of experiences. This means that we see things and experience things in unique ways. To fuel more creativity, we need to find more ways to encourage employees to express themselves and to create an environment where this is the norm. Authenticity also contributes to connectedness. We live in a hyper-connected world now where the quality of your network has a huge impact on your ability to get things done. Right? The more diverse and broad your network, the more resources you have available to fuel your work. This value that lives in the network is called social capital. It's the resources, relationships, information, and opportunity that you can have access to through your relationships with others. And authenticity is a magnet for social capital. Being true to who you are, being a unique and memorable person attracts others to you and makes you stand out. Instead of being just another person that someone meets, being authentic puts you in a category of one. So we hope at this point that you've come to the conclusion that cultivating authenticity is a powerful way for leaders to unleash greater performance, greater innovation, and greater engagement. But knowing and doing it are two very different things. So now we're going to turn our attention to the process for cultivating authenticity. Personal authenticity is the result of an ongoing process with 4 steps. Starts with self-awareness, then self-acceptance, integrity, and daring. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about each of these steps so that you can reflect on how you can facilitate this process for yourself and for others in your workforce. It starts with awareness. We need to help people find clarity about who they are and who they're trying to become. Now, this is pretty heavy work. It involves confronting some really important questions about our values and our intentions and our aspirations. To help people along this very personal journey requires providing tools like assessments and exercises. It involves providing support, which might be in the form of training or coaching, and it involves providing encouragement. Because awareness, when done right, yields powerful and sometimes unexpected insights. People need to be supported through this process. Now, we know that self-awareness isn't a new concept or process. Many of you probably already have programs for this in your leadership development programs or employee development programs. But awareness alone isn't enough. The second phase of this process is acceptance. When you dig deep on self-awareness, individuals discover things about themselves that they like and some things that they don't like. To fuel acceptance involves supporting people in coming to terms with this new information they're gaining about themselves. Ultimately, it's about helping them see how to accentuate the things they love about themselves and how to confront the things about themselves that they don't love or that they didn't like. So ultimately, acceptance is about taking ownership for who you are and declaring that to the world. Integrity is the next step in the process, and integrity is really where rubber meets the road for authenticity. Once you know who you are and have accepted that, integrity demands that you behave accordingly. This is where flying your freak flag becomes challenging. Because what if how I really am doesn't fit in with how others want me to be? What if it makes me the oddball or the weirdo or the outlier, right? This can be hard. Supporting integrity is at least partially about helping individuals build a support system of people around them who encourage their journey and who expect integrity of them. The path to authenticity will be met with resistance, so we must prepare people for that. The final step of individual authenticity is daring. And daring requires that we step outside of our comfort zones to try new things through experimentation and adventure. These new experiences expand our sense of possibility and challenge what we assume to be our limitations. Daring now is not natural for most people, particularly in a work setting. So we can help people through this process by putting them in situations that are new and uncomfortable. Like having them maybe work on new projects or with new people, maybe sending them on a work trip to somewhere that they've never been before. All of these new experiences fuel learning that provides feedback back into the individual's sense of self-awareness. So that's the model. This is the process for developing personal accountability. And the great news is it works with people at any level within the organization, at any age, at any degree of sophistication. But our process of really seizing the opportunity and authenticity doesn't end here. To truly benefit from the power of authenticity in your organization, you need to go one step further than the cultivation of individual authenticity. Individuals must not only fly their own freak flag, but they must advocate and defend others in doing the same. We call this inclusion. If there aren't people throughout your organization that make you a little uncomfortable because of their own freak flag, because of how they fly their freak flag or what their freak flag looks like, then it's probably not working yet. Because freak flags are fun to talk about. But this isn't a feel-good message. Freak flags are critical to business. Cultivating the authenticity of your workforce holds the potential for enormous competitive advantage. But it won't be easy. Authenticity is a concept that most say they value, but few are truly walking the path. Few are truly making the investment in it. The question for you is this: will you have the courage to give this powerful gift and powerful tool to your organization and its employees? We hope you do, and we'd love to help you do it. So there is our 15 minutes of fury, our 15 minutes of content. At this point, we will turn our attention to answering any questions that may have come in. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'll start to I will start to see what we've got. So here's the first question that that came up, and it is, can you speak a little? Well, let's see. Actually, I'm going to start here. What is the best way to sell authenticity to organizations' leadership? Joe, you want to take a crack at that one first?
I can certainly try. I think that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer, just because I think it oftentimes boils down to what the leadership of an organization values and prioritizes. I think there's plenty of things to work with, but I think that's kind of where you've got to start. So, for example, I think one of the things that you can pretty directly connect authenticity to is creativity and innovation. So if that is something that the leadership of the organization values and prioritizes, is talking about, then I think that's, that can be one of the ways that you focus on making that conversation. And then you connect the dots for them. You provide the science and the examples and the case studies showing that authenticity is linked to creativity and innovation. But again, I think it begins with knowing what are the things that really, what are the hot button issues with those folks on the leadership team. Then I think, regardless of what those hot button issues are, I think there's probably something connected to authenticity that you can use, but I think that's where you have to start.
I think that's right on. Here's another one. Can you speak a little to finding the personal courage to embark on this, even if the voice shakes? And I think that's a great question, because authenticity seems to be one of these things, like I said, that most people, if you ask them, will say that they value authenticity or that they strive towards being more authentic. But it's easy to be authentic in the moments where there's little resistance. I think the key is understanding that there will be resistance, and expecting that resistance and being prepared for it. I think in my experience, the key to that is, start small, right? Start by taking small risks. Start by taking small chances, because what I think you will experience, and what sort of early on in my journey with this, what I experienced is when I took small risks, when I took small steps to sort of be more authentic or be more of who I was, I discovered that I was generally rewarded from that. People would sort of reward me for maybe it's speaking up in a meeting, maybe it's speaking a dissenting opinion in a meeting at work that sort of was coming from my point of view. I was a little nervous about asking the question or sharing my point of view, but then after the fact, a number of people would come up and say, "Wow, I'm really glad you asked that question. I was thinking the same thing, but I don't know if I would have asked the question." So I found that it was rewarding, and then the more that I did that, the more positive feedback I got, even though it's hard at first. So, Joe, anything you want to add to that?
Not really. I think that's a great answer, is to start small. And I think to build on that maybe just a little bit, but to try to do small things every day, rather than trying to kind of screw up the courage to take on this big thing that needs to be done. Start doing small things every day so you build those muscles. There's always going to be some discomfort involved. That's how you know that you're doing this work. But I think the more that we do it, the easier it gets, and the more that we understand that feeling. So try to tackle small issues consistently, and I think it gets a lot easier over time.
All right, here's the next question. What if an organization is hung up on compliance? Or, in other words, if the organization wants consistency?
Yeah, and I guess I'll start by taking a crack at that, and I think that's always part of the challenge. Organizations are by nature conformist. Organizations and management, work towards conformity, consistency, control, predictability. I mean, those are kind of the things that the way we do organizations and management deliver. So regardless of the organization, there's going to be a certain tension with this work because you're pushing back on that. And I think where the right balance is, because you're always going to have some of both. You're always going to have some of the conformity and uniformity on one end, and you're going to have a certain amount of diversity and variety and authenticity on the other end. I think, finding where that balance is, that's where a lot of the work is. And I think it's going to be in a different place for, each organization. The Federal Reserve is always going to be different than Google as far as the work experience, and they're going to show up at different places on that continuum. But that's always one of the things that you're going to be working against. Authenticity, diversity, creativity, innovation, those things are not really efficient by nature. They're kind of experimental and wasteful to some extent. They come with really good benefits, but they aren't the kind of benefits that immediately sometimes make sense in a really management-focused environment where all of the conversations are about the business case and the return on investment. You can still have those conversations, but they're a little bit more nuanced. I don't know, Jason, would you add to that?
No, I think that's right, and it ties right into another question that came in, which is, in a bottom line world, how does someone show in dollars and cents how authenticity can save companies money and time? And as I was looking at that, and as you were talking, I was thinking, I think the thing with authenticity, and it ties into innovation and creativity is the same way, is that this isn't about saving time and money. I don't think authenticity is an efficiency play. Although I'm sure that it probably in the long run, innovations that are fueled out of the value that comes from having people contributing more and broader ideas, and that can actually lead to efficiency and time savings. But I think it's more about, it's seizing and creating future value. It's that it's about seizing and unlocking opportunities that don't exist today, that you can't see today, because you're not benefiting from sort of the full spectrum of what your employees or your workforce has to contribute when they're really sort of allowed to make a more broad and full contribution, or when they're expected to sort of bring more of themselves, which I think is tough. But I think when you're making the business case for authenticity, I think it's more about creating opportunity, or more about sort of unlocking the opportunity that is sort of being lost. And I think that, this plays right into that same thing. Compliance and consistency and all of those things really, those are important to businesses as well, but I don't know that it's kind of a counterintuitive thing where you've got to step back, I think, a little bit. Authenticity is going to create a little more chaos potentially, but it certainly creates, it also, you have to have that kind of chaos, or a little bit, you have to have that in order to gain the advantage of it as well. And then I've got, let's see, quick question here, Joe, and I think this is in your wheelhouse. Where can we read more about authenticity at work? I know you cited Orbiting the Giant Hairball as a great book that I think is sort of in line with that, but any other resources that come to mind for you?
I think the first one that comes to mind, Yeah, I know there's some other ones. They're just not coming to mind right now, unfortunately.
Well, if you think of them, we can include those in our follow-up response when we send it
Yes.
out following the webinar. I've got one more question that I'll toss out here in just a second. But I do want to make the comment, and I should have commented earlier, we've got our contact information here. If anyone has specific interests or questions, or they're looking for resources, please feel free to email us directly or hit us on Twitter. We will be following up this webinar with an email with the PowerPoint. If you're interested in that, we'll send out a link to a recording of the webinar so you can share that with others, but we will be making that available. So we have one last question, and the question is, are there any tips or resources that we can share for awareness, meaning, how can we find clarity about who we are? And I'll add, I think, a couple thoughts, and then I'll toss it to you, Joe, and then you can wrap it up. But I think for me, I think there's a lot of resources out there that are, assessment based. I think it's always good to start this process with some things like maybe some personality profiles, some interest profiles, some values assessments or values exercises, things that help you sort of narrow down and really zero in on some sort of basic core things that help you get a better understanding on who you are. I also think it's really important and really valuable to, survey or talk to the people who know you best, who you feel would be honest with you, that would sort of provide you some insight or perspective, sort of on the outside looking in too, on helping you maybe see things about yourself that you don't see. Because the science tells us that when it comes to self-awareness, we are the worst at assessing ourselves. We have a lot of biases and things built in, that sort of protective measures hardwired into our brain that make it really hard for us to see ourselves objectively. And part of self-awareness is doing that. And so using tools and external perspective to really gather a bunch of information that you can process, I think, is really valuable. So what would you add to that, Joe?
Yeah, I think those are really good, and this work is very much about personal reflection. I'm just thinking of a couple of the exercises that we use when we do our workshops on authenticity. We have folks in our workshops write their own eulogy, right? They think about when their time has expired on this planet, what would they like their friends and family to say about them? And the nice thing about that is it's a good reflection exercise, and it helps us have some clarity around the stuff that really matters to us in our life. We sometimes have them write their eulogy. We sometimes will do a value sort where they've got to really identify, just 2 or 3 or 4 really core values. And the nice thing about putting those kinds of things in front of you, how you want to be remembered and what your core values are, is that then you can start saying, okay, if this is who I claim to be, then is it showing up in my life? Am I acting accordingly? And I think, then you've really got some stuff to work with. It's not the hardest work in the world to identify good aspirations. The hard work is about, holding yourself accountable and living up to them. But I think those are a couple of other reflection exercises that are usually pretty helpful to folks.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that this was valuable and that you took some things away from it. If there's any way we can be of service to you, please reach out, and we will look forward to seeing you. We're tentatively planning another 15-minute webinar for the end of August, so stay tuned for more on that, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.